Joe,
Hey,
I'm not going to ask you how you are because I know you're fine. I have a serious question.
on the one day that I'm not fine.
So sorry.
No, I'm fine.
Okay, yeah, I knew it. I knew you're fine. Okay, so when you were growing up, was there a religion in your household or religions that you were aware of?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I was raised Catholic. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But okay, so why do you ask?
Well, I thought it might pertain to today's conversation with Frank Faulk.
Yes,
There's
actually.
your segue.
Completely. Yes. Frank Faulk, welcome to our podcast.
I'm excited to have you here. I'm just going to do my gushing now and get it over with. You're one of my favorite radio documentary makers ever in my whole life. Whenever I heard there was a Frank Faulk documentary coming on, whatever show it was, I'm like, oh, I got to listen to that.
It's so bizarre, our own sort of interior sense of ourselves, or at least my sense of myself. So I'm delighted to hear that. And at the same time, I find it so interesting how my sense of myself can be so different from people's sense of me, for the better and for the worse. It's like, really? You think that about me? Really? You think that about me?
Yeah, it can go both ways. But I was very excited to see you're going to be a guest on the show.
I'm thrilled. And I'm especially thrilled because, as I was saying to my wife, what's great is I'm talking to two people I really like. It's not, so I feel really comfortable. And I have so enjoyed your podcast and the atmosphere you create for your guests. It's just, I thought, I don't have to be afraid.
I can't imagine that you would. I mean, I've known Frank longer than I've known you, Mark. I went to school with Frank at Ryerson.
I believe that. You guys are really old.
You know what, Mark? You'll get there too.
Oh, I know. I'm old too.
Then we went on to work at the CBC at the same time. And you've always been a really good friend. And from listening to this podcast, and thank you for listening to this podcast, and we always appreciate your feedback, that we get the guests to introduce themselves. And we wonder if you would do us the honor of doing that for yourself today. Okay.
I was really afraid that you would ask me that question because I get thrown off when people at a party I'm meeting say, so how are you doing? A friend or something. I go, oh, how am I doing? That's a good question. So I thought about that. I knew you might ask me that. I was hoping. So I'm going to answer that in the spirit of William Blake. Okay. So if it sounds a bit precious, I apologize, but I just felt I had to sort of how can I be really honest about this? So I'm a former CBC producer of radio documentaries who is now retired, and I look forward to nothing, at least when I'm paying attention. And I lack ambition of any kind, at least when I'm paying attention. And the only two things I'm certain of about myself is that I'm going to die, and I don't know when, which is why I really think it's important to pay attention. So that's my introduction.
Wow. Can you do us one favor with respect to the whole dying thing? If you could just refrain from dying during this podcast.
I don't know. That's just it. I don't even know if Mark or you are going to be here in the next 5 minutes.
Well, I got to say, if one of us does snuff it during this podcast, it's probably going to be good for ratings.
It's so funny you say that because I was having that fantasy and I was thinking, I was going through this bizarre, dark fantasy of being shot by someone bursting into the apartment while doing this podcast and thinking, Joe and Mark would have this amazing tape. I don't know why I went there, but
Well, so much for Frank.
That's a really dark thought. It's the kind of thing I think about sometimes, except usually it's a clown with the submachine gun.
But okay, so we've mentioned William Blake, and that is because that is who you are here to talk to us about today, William Blake.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what I know that we usually, the podcasts, usually someone's talking about a specific piece of art. And in this case, I will speak of a specific piece of art by Blake, his book of poetry, Songs of Innocence and Experience. But I really it's more of a portal into Blake. And I think it's for people who are interested in Blake, but haven't really ever taken him on. Songs of Innocence and of Experience is a really wonderful book to dive into. But I think it's really important to talk about what he has done to me, for me creatively.
Yeah, I was going to say I think it's a good choice though, because it's probably the most approachable of his more well-known works, right? It's one that you can read and go, oh, that's okay. I think I get that. whereas some of his other stuff can be a little bit hard to figure out what's really going on.
Well, it's interesting, Mark, because I have all his epic poems, which I've kind of looked through some of them. I've read Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which is a wonderful book, and I've read a lot of his poetry and Songs of Innocence and of Experience. But I began to read Milton because I had taken on Paradise Lost. Mm-hmm. And Blake's book on Milton is really a kind of a response to Milton. But it said in the introduction, now many people have decided to take on Blake and start to read Milton or one of his epic poems, and a few lines in decide their sanity is more important than trying to understand Blake.
Oh boy. Oh, I guess I screwed up. I kept reading.
And the thing is, I've made my way through quite a bit of Milton, and it's wonderful. Like I'm still sort of feel like I'm like reading is going to be like doing a marathon, and I'm not quite sure why, because I do these little jogs through it, and I go, oh, that's so beautiful. That's amazing. So I think having now read Paradise Lost, which is amazing, I'll have a better understanding of what he's critiquing about Milton in his epic poem, Milton.
And maybe you're not having that negative response because you are ready in this time in your life and everything that's gone before. And with that in mind, I wonder if we could set the stage for this, because some people listening may not know your background. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and the work you did for CBC and how that informed your choice to talk to us about Blake today?
Okay, so let me just ask you. So you really want me just in terms of my career at the CBC? We're not talking about, well, I was born on a snowy day in Manhattan.
It's your choice.
I mean, I think one of the things I loved about your documentaries, Frank, was just how thoughtful they were and cerebral they were. And I mean, I think we share similar interests in the idea of spirituality and religion and like how those things play out in an individual's life. So I think that is part of what I think Joe's looking for.
Absolutely.
And how that connects.
Yep.
Yeah.
Just keep it less than 15 words if you could.
That's right. The clowns have been deployed in case. I'm terrified, but it's funny too.
For Mark's sake, because he's a professor, he teaches in an academic setting, he might appreciate this. So I'll start with going back to Ryerson, just to say I dropped out of high school in grade 10. And did a whole bunch of stuff, moved out to the country, built a log cabin, or, bunch of stuff, but decided around the age of 30 to go back to school. And it turned out to be really a great experience. I mean, funnily enough, I had to do a kind of a qualifying year because I didn't feel that I could handle the academic load, because everyone is an Ontario scholar who gets into RTA. I was sadly disappointed. But anyway, there were very sweet people like Joe who were like just kindred spirits, even though they were like 10 years younger than I was. But anyway, so I go to RTA, go to do that. And then I worked on some shows, like probably don't know the Shirley Show. It was like Canada's answer to Oprah Winfrey. Not really, but that's what I thought it was. And then I ended up getting work at the CBC as a researcher on Marketplace, and then ended up as kind of the executive producer of Man Alive. I think it's easier to say that. So I was doing Man Alive because I've always had a deep interest in the spiritual dimension of life. Always been drawn to that. And so with the CBC, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I never had any thoughts of going into radio, by the way. That's the interesting thing. No interest in radio whatsoever. I was interested in children's television. I worked on Degrassi doing PA stuff for a year. But I ended up, when I took over Man Alive, that was great, but they were trying to kill it. So that was very frustrating. They kill shows by moving them all around. And then I ended up on another show where I was deeply unhappy. And the vice president of radio, Jane Chalmers at the time, who was the only manager who actually got to know me, ever took an interest in me.
I like Jane. Yeah.
Yeah. No. And I was working on this show and it was horrible. It was stressful. And I said, Jane, I don't think I have to leave the CBC. And she said, I have to leave that show. I might even leave the CBC. And she said, don't leave the show. Just, I'm here. I have your back, but it's important that you stay on that show, because it was a bunch of young people and they were doing crazy stuff. And so I had enough. And one day, and I called her up at home, she said, here's my phone number. Call me up at home if you ever, or actually seriously.
Wow.
I called her up and said, hi, Jane. It was a Saturday afternoon. I've had it. I'm quitting. She said, don't. We'll figure something out. Don't quit. That was amazing. I mean, I think it's
Yeah.
amazing. And she was in radio. So I said, well, I'd love to do radio. And she said, I can't put you in radio, but if you can make things happen, I can certainly then help with that. So I ended up doing a first personal for the Sunday edition on my father's death. And then I pitched a story to Tapestry called my interest in tarot cards, whether this was a sign of insanity. Were these tools of, creative tools to work with, not for divination. I never thought they were for divination. And that's where I first kind of got a chance to have my voice heard. In fact, Bernie Look, who was the executive producer of Ideas, heard that piece and began to use it in his class that he taught at Ryerson as kind of a personal voice. So that was very encouraging. And then I ended up doing a documentary on my father called Deep in the Heart of Texas. It was really after 9/11. And he had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era. And he had always said that it was a terrifying time. As he would say to me, Frank Doby, you don't know what it's like to live in a country that's gripped in terror and fear. And I was feeling that. I was feeling, is this happening again? So I pitched a story, and that kind of opened the door to radio documentaries and kind of a personal approach, personal documentaries, we called them, kind of docu-essays, if you will. And fortunately, I was given quite a bit of free rein and got to explore more fully my interest in the spiritual issues of faith, what faith is. In fact, I did a piece, and then I'll end it here for Tapestry. And it was called God and Other Dirty Words. And it was really dealing with the difficulty of the lexicon of faith, because I realized that when I was working on Man Alive, someone had asked me who worked on the show, do you believe in God? And I said, no. And she actually began to cry because we had bonded quite close around spiritual things. And I thought, now, why did I say that? Because in fact, God is completely significant and central to my life, however you want to understand that word. But that is very important to me. I thought, why is that? And I thought, well, I think in this culture, especially at the CBC, you're perceived as kind of weak-minded if you say that you believe in God or you have some religious faith. It's simple-minded. And certainly there are a lot of people who do have faith and are simple-minded, but that's true about people who don't have faith and they're simple-minded.
There's a very strong current of that, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
The new atheist movement.
Exactly. And I did a piece called Walking the Edge of Reason and Awe, where I interviewed Chris Hedges, who was just furious about what he considered atheist fundamentalists. He said they're just as bad as religious fundamentalists. They just sort of, and I said, I notice you're getting angry. And he said, yeah, I am getting angry because there's a lot of there's wisdom in the Bible. Like, you shouldn't shut yourself off from that, just to kind of dismiss it and have people like Richard Dawkins say, oh, it's just a book of fairy tales. No, it's a bit more than that.
Oh, yeah. And that is, Mark, you had asked about my religion at the beginning of the podcast. I said raised Catholic. And I've always appreciated being raised Catholic because it did walk me through the Bible. And I do have a reverence for it.
Or at least a literacy around it. I mean,
Yes.
one of the big problems I see is lack of critical literacy, critical thinking. People are scientifically illiterate and they're biblically illiterate. They just don't know. Anyway, so just to get to Blake, so I was given the opportunity to do a documentary on Blake because it was the 250th anniversary of his death, I think. So that is what I was familiar with Blake for having been, a teenager in the late 60s and doing psychedelics and, and all that really, Blake was there, of course, but never, he was more there as, things like, to see a heaven in a wildflower, hold eternity in the palm of your hand. Those, I think I have that right. But this documentary really kind of made me really deeply appreciate what Blake was about and what he was doing and how radical he was, not just politically, but that he was not only a visionary, but he was a radical psychologist. I mean, his critique of what was happening to the subject's experience of themselves, was brilliant, and it's relevant today.
Yeah, he was revolutionary in a real sense, and he lived in a revolutionary time. He was writing during the period of the French Revolution, and that's the Songs of Innocence and Experience came out in 1789, which is when the French Revolution started. But he wasn't really a revolutionary in that sense. He was a revolutionary in the sense of, as you say, psychology. He actually understood something about human psychology that other people didn't. It's interesting because he's kind of claimed by the Romantics.
Yeah, that he's not a romantic.
But he's not really a romantic. And he's definitely not an Enlightenment thinker, at
Oh,
least
no,
not in the traditional sense, right?
No.
He's not about science and rationality. He's all about imagination and the inner life.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to get you guys to stop down right there and just a few words on Romantics versus Enlightenment for those people who may not be familiar with that.
That's a good question. Well, I mean, the Enlightenment is where science comes from. It starts in the Renaissance, but, the next century, it starts to really build. And people start to figure out, oh, we've got this thing called the empirical process, and we can actually figure out how the world really works. We don't have to just listen to what, sorry, Joe, the Catholic Church tells us about how the world works, which, of course, had an influence on the world in a pretty major way. And so eventually we got to a point where I would say it was kind of a reductive idea that we are going to be able to describe exactly how the universe is via science.
What was happening with science is when what he was first, he wasn't anti-science by
No.
any means. What he was anti was that this is the only way to the truth. We reveal the truth. He's already seen that with religion,
Yeah.
that kind. And what he was really concerned about in terms of what you're talking about empiricism was the rise of the empirical self. And the notion of the empirical self is that human knowledge comes predominantly from experiences gathered through the five senses, and that we reflect on these experiences and then we act upon these experiences, but we're passive observers. And what he realized, and what neuroscience completely validates, because I interviewed a neuroscientist for one of my documentaries.
A couple of 100 years later, it's worth noting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Blake, he saw that thinking and perceiving, which we have thinking and perceiving as two separate acts. We perceive, and what we perceive is just what is there. And then we reflect on that, right? Or we assume that what we're thinking is an objective representation of what is happening, right? So perception was seen as a passive act. And in fact, the more you could eliminate the subject from what you're perceiving, the better, because then you have objective knowledge, and objective knowledge is the most important, don't you know? Yeah, but what about me? Screw you. What he realized, and what neuroscience is saying, is that thinking and perception, they interpenetrate each other. Thinking shapes perception.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And our perception then shapes thinking. It's one process. We don't so much think about reality. We think reality. And that's a radically different way of understanding how we are and what's happening. Because to your point about, Mark, when you said, this kind of reductionist approach to the world, and that we could kind of figure out all the parts and make it all work and everything, the reason why we'll never solve the mystery of nature is because we ourselves are part of that mystery. It's like no matter how fast you turn around, you're not going to see the back of your head. You can't even see your face. You don't even know really what you look like. You know what your reflection looks like, but you don't know what you look like.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's pretty wild when you think about that, because we have images of what we look like, and we assume that other people see that image, right?
True.
Yeah. We can't even agree on what blue is. or if the dress is blue or white.
The fool and the wise man do not see the same tree.
Yeah. So just to get back to the whole continuum, because I don't think we quite got there, because I think what you've done, Frank, is you've pointed out really well how Blake is kind of at that fulcrum point between what we consider the Enlightenment, which is about, these laws that we're trying to discover. And a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, to be fair, were deists. They believed in God, and they believed that they were using these processes to describe what God had created.
Reason was
paramount in that view. And then really Romanticism, I think, is a reaction to that in a sense. And so the importance of emotion becomes the sort of raison d'etre, that's a pun, of like the Romantic movement. It's like, it's all about the emotional outpourings that the artists want to explore. And there isn't a huge number of Romantic scientists that we can point to that would be, romanticists and scientists, but some, because they would say, yeah, you know what? There's an important part of science here that's being left out. And that's where we are now, right? Where we have, like you say, neuroscience is actually exploring kind of the intersection of these things.
Yes.
And, advanced physics is really in a way as well. And so that's why Blake is, to me, I'm fascinated by Blake. He's always interested me as a literary character and as an artist, because I think it's important to mention that he was in addition to being a writer, he was an artist. He's just as well known for his engravings and paintings and as he is for his poetry.
Yes, yes. And I just want to add to and you can, I think you would confirm this or affirm it, is that part of the romantic thing also was, whereas science saw nature as something to control, manipulate, and the romantic movement was kind of a return to nature, kind of meditation on nature, that nature was revelation in a sense, and that you would feel the sense of uplift by being with nature and, as opposed to, torturing nature.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. That was definitely and if you look at romantic painting, that's really what romantic painting is about.
Right.
And that way, Blake is a little bit like, he's a predecessor essentially of that.
But he's suspicious of nature too. Like he doesn't talk about Mother Nature. He thinks nature can be quite cruel. Like the Garden of Eden wasn't a wilderness. It was a garden. So he sees the human imagination as humanizing creation, working, transforming creation through the human imagination. Right.
That's true. So you said that he's had a huge influence in your creative life, and I'm interested in how that's the case.
Yes, I would be happy to do that. Well, what he made me aware of was that the imagination is not simply something that happens at certain moments. And I think, unfortunately, because we've all been so cut off from our inherently creative capacities, we have people who are artists who create, and we have people who are the consumers of that art and often want to create, so we have writing, we go to work, before I went to the CBC, I explored many ways to express myself, but I was in many ways, I felt don't mean to be crude, but very constipated creatively.
That's a great way to describe it.
We've all felt that constipation, Frank.
Yeah. And many of us have had that view of our creations after we've created them.
A friend of mine who's a visual artist, and I think I've shared this anecdote with Joe. I was visiting him once in his studio, and he was drawing. And I said, "So how's it going, Doug?" He said, "Well, sometimes I squint at it, and I think, God, this is brilliant. And other times I squint at it and go, this is a piece of shit." It all depends on how I squint at it. Things are great for life, It all depends on how you squint at it. So in terms of how, what he made me realize, or what he helped awaken me to, not realize, he awakened me to, that the imagination, that in a sense, we're all artists because we're always creating. We're actually always in a process of, in a sense, improvising our existence moment to moment, because you haven't lived your life before. I haven't lived my life. As I said, I don't know what's going to happen. If the clown that Joe has called to come in and assassinate me will be coming in 20 minutes. So in a sense, the question isn't whether we're creative. Let's pretend we're all jazz musicians in a great jazz band, and we can't leave. We can't leave this. So we either can listen to each other and play really well and make music, realize that we're all kind of improvising and it's a creative process. And because we're always imagining our lives, our imagination is what gives shape to reality, our sense of who we are. It's a shaping force in our life. So it was kind of a creative X-lax, if you will. You're creative, Frank. You don't have to try to be creative. You are creative. The question you have to ask yourself is, are you doing it well? When I was listening to your podcast yesterday, Mark, I thought it was a really important point, is that we're not innocent bystanders in life. We're all involved in life. Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as kind of like, well, I'll just stand aside and watch it. No. And I keep on having these moments. I think we all do at different times, where you realize, oh, no, this is the meaning of it. This is it. As I think, as Lily Tomlin's famous for saying, it's not a dress rehearsal, right? Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. Not doing something is a choice. It's doing something.
Exactly. I find this going back to these kind of ridiculous contradictions, or these things that are presented as being kind of smart, but when you really take them they contradict themselves. So you often hear, life has no meaning. And of course, we're made to feel that way because, of course, it's just a material process and we're just a part of that material process. And consciousness is just synapses going off in your brain, and it's nothing more.
Yes, that would be the very reductive view of, yeah.
No, I heard a person, do you know Michael Shermer?
Yeah.
I want to say his name because I think he should be criticized for this. He's the editor of Skeptic Magazine. And he was on Tapestry, a show on CBC that's supposed to deal with spiritual things. And he says to the host at one point, he says, really, when it gets right down to it, we're just brains observing brains. And I'm going, Wow. What dark place are you in?
Well, that's
As opposed to somebody that you refer to frequently, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who says that actually, if we stand around and look at what's really going on, we would be in a state of constant radical amazement.
Well, he talks about the capacity for radical amazement, that we should never become adjusted to life. So
it's a bit about perspective, though, right? Because some people will say things are really terrible. And my observation is like, well, it seems like lots of things are going right.
Yes.
Like we're still here. We're
Yeah.
still talking. We're still, we're still living our lives. It's not a nuclear slag heap, which it could very well be.
Well, I do like to remind people that the news is really just a distilled version of reality.
Yes.
And it's not distilling the good stuff.
It is. Yeah.
It's not even a distillation of reality. It's a particular perspective on reality, because there's all sorts of different news that you hear complete contradictions. If you read the Toronto Sun, you're going to get a very different perspective than the Toronto Star. Is it because the Toronto Sun lies and the Toronto Star tells the truth? No, it's because they're bringing a different perspective to reality. But my point is, and what Blake's point is, we're all involved in this together.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually participating together. So it's not a question, which kind of saves you from sliding into kind of a postmodern kind of thing of, oh, there's no objective reality and whatever you make it. No, we are in this together. We're creating together. We are responsible for what is going on. The problem is not out there. It's in here. It's in consciousness that we share.
He's pointing at his head, listeners. But you know what? To Mark's point, because it kind of speaks to something that Blake wrote, which is something you introduced to me, Frank, and which I love, the whole business of joy and woe. The news basically just focuses on the woe.
Yeah.
And leaves out the joy. But as Blake would point out, life is an interweaving of joy and woe.
Right. But he would also, I think he would be a wonderful critic of how media basically has taken over our mind. We literalize what we're hearing on media. This is actually happening. What actually is happening when we're watching the news is we're looking at or listening to the radio, and these sounds are coming out and being put together, or we're hearing this. Other people hear different things. It's not just that they're just focusing on the woe and, we need some good news. It's and this isn't to say all news is fake. I'm just saying we lose awareness. These people are just like us. The people who make the news, I worked at the CBC. I know they're neurotic. They have insecurities. They have their biases. They have their assumptions. And if we're going to actually get along and really listen, then we need to also question our own assumptions. And believe me, as you know, Joe, I spoke to lots of people who were in editorial positions who I thought, I don't know where anyone gets this idea that anything's objective. I mean, these people are like making decisions, editorial decisions that they're not even aware of because they don't like the way this person talks.
Yes, that's very true. Yeah. It's teaching young journalists is one of the hardest things. The thing I find most frustrating is, and I think this is really true in a lot of people who work in the media, is they have a certain narrative in their head, and that's the story they're going to tell. And that's not necessarily the story that's there to be found.
No.
And that's why curiosity is so important, because if you can be curious about things, then it's possible to go, oh, okay, that's not what I had in my head, but this is actually a much more interesting idea. Let's follow this idea.
Yes. And I was having this problem with a friend of mine who worked in news for a long time, and I wasn't expressing it well. So what she heard me saying is that it's all fake news. It's all fake news. I'm not saying that.
No.
And I'm not saying it's just everyone's opinion, because there are some opinions that are worth listening to. When you go see a doctor, if he's a good doctor, the doctor will say, you might want to get a second opinion.
Well, you have to employ your critical faculties as you're listening to this.
Exactly. The thing that I find disturbing is that people seem to think when they're looking at their TV, at the news, it's a window. They're looking at it. No, you're not looking at a window. You're looking at an electronic box that is.
To bring this back to Blake, this is where Blake is like, hey, yeah, facts are important, but we also have our inner life you have to bring to it. And that was, I think, more his perspective, was bringing the imagination and, the childhood perspective, which is what the Songs of Innocence is about, right?
Yes.
To the facts. Yeah.
But now, before we get into the Songs of Innocence, though, Frank, can you humanize Blake for us?
Yes.
There's no way we could do this in an hour. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, just tell us a little bit about the man.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah.
So he was born in 1957.
Wait, are we talking about a different Blake? I'm confused.
He was born in 1757, died in 1827. He was basically, as a young child, he was apprenticed at the age of 10. He went to an art school, and then he was apprenticed to an engraver. He did have visions as a young child. He saw angels in trees, so he was very sensitive to the unseen world, so to speak, or very, very rich imagination. I see him as a patron saint for every artist who is ahead of their time, or likes to believe they're ahead of the time. And that's why no one's buying their book or listening to them. But whatever, I mean, he is the true, the patron saint of artists who are not commercially successful. Not only not commercially successful, but are ridiculed and made fun of, because he was ridiculed. It's quite heartbreaking. He put on his own show because no gallery would show his stuff. And it was ridiculed. Basically the person said he's mad and he should be put in jail.
Whoa.
But fortunately, his madness seems rather harmless, so maybe not. Maybe that would be going too far. But no, he was considered just crazy and not appreciated whatsoever. And so he was, and he loved children. He was married to a woman named Catherine. They never had children. They lived in poverty. Basically, they lived, pretty well hand to mouth. And he was buried in a pauper's grave. So when he died, he was put in a grave that already contained 3 other bodies.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So it's not like he enjoyed it in another way, and in a much more serious way, not just in terms of if you're not a successful artist, think of Blake. He wasn't successful. I guess what he really has awakened in me and made me appreciate was process. It's all process. It's all process. Whatever the end is, there will be another beginning.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that, to do the work because you need to do the work. Not because you're going to get famous or because you're going to get rewarded for it. I mean, surely, any artist creates because they want to communicate. And I'm sure it was very heartbreaking for him that so many people thought he was mad, because he only began to have a fan base when he was close to dying. Some young people really took an interest in him. I think they were maybe even young romantics,
But he had a slight fan base. He had a few people who were,
yes.
I mean, that's one of the interesting things when you read about the Songs of Innocence and Experience, is he did the Songs of Innocence came out in 1789. And then I can't remember when he put the volume of
1794.
94. Okay. So that was, 5 years between books. So don't feel too bad, Joe. But he had people asking for the volume for the rest of his life. So he continued to print editions of the book, and it was always different, slightly different, because he decided to change something, and he was an engraver. That was his trade. I mean, in some ways you could argue he was a very successful artist in the sense that he made his living with his art. He never really had a job in the sense of,
He didn't work for someone else. He produced.
He did. No, he in the time that he didn't live in London, he was living in the east of England, working for a poet who hired him to illustrate his manuscripts. So,
right.
Yeah, man. Yeah. No, we wouldn't know their name now because William Blake.
Isn't that funny? Hey?
It's giant in comparison. So it depends on your perspective, really. I'm sure for him, it was very hard to not be accepted.
And now, just to fast forward because I want to get to the Songs of Innocence. At his death, there's a story that a woman who was present, she had a very strong reaction to his death. Are you familiar with that story, Frank?
No, I just know that he was singing when he died.
Wow, that's wild.
What was he singing?
I don't know but he was it was just a simple, it was very joyful. It was singing a song, and then he just kind of died.
I read somewhere that he sung a lot of his poems. He had a song that went with a lot of his poems.
Well, I do know that the Songs of Innocence, which are very childlike, were written with children in mind and had music, were supposed to be sung. Now the music is lost, or whether there's just tunes they used at that time that were common that you could just sort of use, but they were meant to be sung.
And of course, he wrote one of the most famous hymns of all time,
Jerusalem.
Yeah.
No. And that's in his epic poem. That's actually in Milton, not in his epic poem Jerusalem, which I find bizarre. In Jerusalem,
that's the one, Joe, that in Monty Python, where the guy, wherever you ask about beds, he puts the paper bag on his head. I can't remember what the sketch was, but they have to get into a tub or something and sing Jerusalem. And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains?
Monty Python's tribute to William Blake.
Yeah, those aren't the right lyrics.
Okay.
I do just want to say before we get to Songs of Innocence, just to answer a question you had asked me earlier about, because I think it's important, the joy and woe, and in terms of my work. When I did the documentary on William Blake, one of the women who I interviewed, because all the people I interviewed were basically talking as though William Blake was still very present in their life.
Mm-hmm.
It was a doctor, it was a poet. And one of the guests that I interviewed used the term luminous companion. And I love that term. So I refer to him now as my luminous companion. There's certain other thinkers I go, they're a luminous companion. I mean, they illuminate my life for me. You know,
I love that. Boy, that's going to be a takeaway for me from this conversation.
It's beautiful.
I will remember that forever, because I think we all have luminous companions.
Yeah, who are very present. You feel they're very active. You hear their voice when you're kind of in a dark place and you read them. So Abraham Heschel, certainly a luminous companion, certainly Blake. But I just wanted to say it because this is important. One of the things that she said was she was talking about how she discovered Blake and that she had just grabbed a book of his poems. She had gone down to Florida and gotten this little sort of crummy little motel room because her boyfriend, who she was going to marry, had dumped her. And she said, and I was just devastated. I didn't know what I was doing. And she said, and I open up Blake, and it's the wonderful poem, Auguries of Innocence. And in that, she said, there's a wonderful part where he says, it is right, it should be so. Man was made for joy and woe. And she said, to hear that, when your heart is broken and you feel your life is over, she said, I just felt all of a sudden the blue room I was in became like a blue egg, and I felt it just cracked open. And the heavens were above me, and I just felt transformed. And I was so moved by that because she was so, we all been those places of darkness. And so that really became something I internalized, just those, joy and woe. I mean, I read the whole poem in the larger context, and it's one of the few poems, at least parts of it, that I can actually recite. But believe me, it's a powerful mantra, especially if you're going through, as I was at that time at the CBC, a very dark time.
And when this we rightly know, through the world we safely go.
Exactly. And I love that, Joe, because once you know that, you're safe. You're not surprised. You're not blindsided. It's like, oh, right. Yeah, right. Go enjoy. And tragedy is a dimension of life. There is such tragedy all the time. So to deny that is to live a very superficial life, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, to me, it's actually like a key, like it's a master key to life.
Yes.
Because when you do understand that concept, of course, there's joy and woe. That's as
they're woven fine. It's not like there's joy here and there's woe here. And no, they're together.
Yes. So when something bad happens, yes, it's horrible and it's bad, and you got to deal with it and you got to process and whatnot. But you also understand in your gut that that's just the way that it is.
And also, I mean, like, as Joe knows, my sister has stage 4 metastatic lung cancer. And when she was diagnosed with that, obviously it was devastating for me. She's my only surviving sister, only family member, and it was devastating for her. But in the process, she's, of course, discovered she has wonderful friends who have just been there, and the health care that she's got, the doctors and nurse. So there's joy in that. That's the joy amidst the tragedy. There's also joy, the affirmation that people are kind. People are kind. And that's, to your point, Mark, that you made earlier. That's why we haven't blown ourselves up, because the capacity for human kindness, for simple human kindness, has not yet been destroyed. And if it hasn't been destroyed yet, it probably won't be destroyed, because we are connected. We are related. We know that.
Okay. In the remaining 30 seconds of this podcast. So let's get to your choice.
That's hilarious.
Songs of Innocence. There it is. He's holding it up. And
oh, that's a nice looking edition.
Can you describe the cover of that, Frank?
Well, the cover has Adam and Eve seeming to be cast out of the garden, engulfed with these flames, and in letter engraving, it's the Songs of Innocence and of Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. Now, fire, on one hand, you can look at this fire and think, oh, well, that's the cherubim at the gates of Eden, right, with a flaming sword. But fire for Blake was a cleansing, was consumed and cleansed, and so it could be a very purifying image that we're seeing here, even though they've been cast out. Because for Blake, the fall is the fall into self-division, right? The fall into subject-object, the fall into I must control the bad me or the good me, I mean, the I and the me is the object, so there's this world of division that we fall into. And so the book, Songs of Innocence and of Experience, the book of poems, where he looks at the two contrary states of the human soul, the times when we have that sense of innocence, but also experience. And of course, we associate innocence with our childhood. So a lot of the poems in his innocence part, in the Songs of Innocence, are very sweet. And I think, but what's wonderful about the book is that it does really deal with the creative tension between the polarities of life. So, and the two poems that I've picked that really capture this, though there's lots of poems throughout it that kind of mirror each other. There's a poem in Innocence called The Lamb. Mm-hmm. And there's the poem that a lot of people are familiar with, Tiger, Tiger, which is an experience, right? So just to say, the Songs of Experience, you're quite right, Mark. And it was first issued as a separate work in 1789. And then by 1794, they were being sold together.
Right, yeah.
And there are only a few copies were made.
Yeah, like literally handfuls of, I think I read somewhere there was 26 copies of the combined volume sold over the years.
Wow.
And I mean, the brilliance of it and of his work is that he figured out how to not only write and do the pictures, but publish. I mean, he became his own publisher because he developed a technique of engraving and illustrating at this, so they could be seen together.
So 26 self-published copies.
Yeah.
Yep.
So indie writers take heart.
He was not on Amazon.
In 200 years, someone might be talking about you.
Exactly.
300 years.
Exactly. Exactly. So The Lamb, I'll just give you. It's fairly short. Should I read or just read a few?
Please.
Yeah, absolutely. Read the poem because it's a great one.
So The Lamb is a very, the illustration that goes with it is really pastoral, as you can see. It's it's a young shepherd boy with a sheep. It's just lovely. It's lovely. He says, "Little lamb," and you can almost hear it reading this to a child. "Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead, gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly bright, gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild. He became a little child. I a child and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee. Little lamb, God bless thee." Now, just in reading this slowly, I haven't read it for a few days. It just has so much there, actually, because what he's really done in a very nice way is he's kind of joined this unity between the divine and the human, right? Mm-hmm. Lamb symbolizes Christ, the child, but the boy is a child like Christ. They're together. It's just this wonderful, and Blake was very much about that, the particular and the universal together. That's why you can see heaven in a wildflower or a world in a grain of sand. It's always the particular and the universal, not one or the other. They're always arising together, right?
It's also heretical, though, right? In the sense that Jesus didn't make the lamb. God made the lamb.
Yeah, of course, though, but many Christians believe that Jesus was God, right?
Yes.
So,
but in his society, that would have been seen as a strange thing to say, right?
At that time, yeah.
Now, compare that, that feeling and that kind of the way it was very gentle and everything, to Tiger, Tiger. So, interesting about the Tiger is that the spelling, it's not Tiger, it's Tyger. There are different theories for why that is. One that seems to be is that tiger, the way it's spelled here, is an obsolete and archaic spelling of tiger. And Blake chooses this word to add a layer of exotic and archaic flavor to his poem. Like he's trying to refer to the world at an earlier stage, right? Mm-hmm. So he goes, And it's this kind of driving beat to tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? So in the first Lamb, the poem of the Lamb, you have the question when the child says, do you know who made thee? God made thee. Mm-hmm. Now, Blake doesn't answer that question. He says, did he who make thee? But he doesn't answer the question. It's like he's really, to me, what's so powerful about that is the sense of the joy and woe. I mean, the joy is really that feeling of openness, of and now this woe is like God is terrifying. You know, this kind of meta kind of reflection on the dark side of God. And of course, in the Hebrew Bible, in Isaiah, I think it is, God says, I am God. I created evil and I created good. I created dark. I created light. Which really is a very different sense of what happens. In the New Testament, that gets all split into two. The devil becomes the dark and God is all good. And Jesus is, it all becomes very kind of, the point being, and I think Blake was, so that poem, Tiger, Tiger, is a very, a lovely companion. Lovely companion. But is it's a sister. It's referred to as a sister poem of the Lamb, and captures very much, or expresses, gives to that, the polarities of life, kind of, and to hold those both, and to know that there are things about life that are terrifying and that fill you with terror. And also at the same time as those tiger, great beauty. That's the sense of the sublime, right? Or the encounter with the numinous, that sense of terror, but also
awe. It's awe. The word is awe, which is overused. Awesome is an overused word now, but it's too bad because awe does. I mean, just the act of saying it, awe, like your mouth goes open.
Right.
You can't not open your mouth when you say awe, and because it is talking about the numinous. It's talking about just being overtaken by
gobsmacked, basically.
You're gobsmacked. You're overtaken by this reality. It's like, oh my God. Yeah. And he does that all through both books too. Like there's a bunch of poems that he opens. Like I was wondering if you're going to talk maybe about the chimney sweeps, because he has a poem in the Innocence about a chimney sweep, and there's a dark tone to it. Yes. Because of course it's a child. It's a child who's been forced to spend his life sweeping out chimneys, and this was a thing that happened in that era, that children were put in chimneys to clean them. And then in fact it was so horrible that they actually even passed a law back then that said, you can't have kids younger than 8 doing this. There's a poem in the Songs of Innocence that is actually about a chimney sweep, and it's actually kind of sweet in a way, because it's talking about, like you say, Frank, these the things about life that are still about living that are still joyful. Whereas in the Songs of Experience, it's not nearly like that joyful. No. It's more about the dark side of it. And he does that with a bunch of poems. And what's interesting to me is that sometimes he would move the poems.
Yes.
From Innocence to Experience later on, when he was doing like these one-offs, when people would ask, because people would say, I've heard this is fabulous and I'd like my own copy. And so he would print a copy for the person who wanted it, and he'd change poems then.
Exactly. Yeah, it gets very dark.
Yeah.
There's wonderful poems like London, and one of the great lines from London is mind-forged manacles. And I love that, when they're mind-forged manacles. And I think that really sort of like speaks to, because part of, just to get back to the empirical self that he was so critical of, is he saw the negative consequences of that belief that we exist as isolated subjects encountering an objective material reality. And it gives rise to the belief that material reality is all that's actually real. It's the only certain, solid, and knowable reality. And, the subject or the self feels itself, we feel ourselves to be isolated, kind of lonely, and whatever, we have these thoughts, but they're our private thoughts. They don't really, matter. And of course, it's a lie. So that's why we have such a profound sense of estrangement and alienation and mental health. I mean, from the past 40 years, like people talking about, sense of life has no meaning. It's a tale told by an idiot, right? It's a tale told by an idiot and my life is meaningless. And of course, and that's all reinforced. I mean, when your main message that I certainly got growing up was life has no meaning in itself, but we give it meaning. So meaning isn't given with being. We give being meaning. And this is no, that's not how it works. Because the meaning and significance to life is what we all share, that meaning and significance. We all are part of that beingness. We share that being. Anyway, I'm getting a little off topic, but I do think, and I think Mark will agree with this, that the Songs of Innocence and Song of Experience is a wonderful introduction. And maybe as far as you go with Blake, people have attempted to read Milton and decide their sanity was more important than understanding Milton. I'm finding it quite interesting.
But you're clearly insane, Frank.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we share that, Frank.
This is sanity. I'm happy to be considered insane.
Woohoo!
But I would say not only is Blake a wonderful artist and you'll be enriched by his art, but he actually is a radical psychologist. And if you actually get into his critique of modernity, he's one of the early critics of modernity and the implications of that and the alienation and the trauma of materialism, basically. When you have this belief that the ground of existence is just simply matter. And because then where there is no place for you really, you're just kind of, as someone explained when we were talking about consciousness and Darwin's theory of evolution, I don't know. It's sort of like it's secreted by matter in some way, in the way that urine is secreted by the kidneys. It sort of happens. No explanation. Don't know why I'm here. And there's no reason for me to, you know what I mean? He was really wonderful at articulating the inner experience of the subject with the experience of being a subject.
I was trying to think of some pithy way to wrap this up, but I think you just did that, Frank. So thank you.
Well, I want to thank you both so very much for inviting me to be part of this podcast. I think you guys are doing great stuff. And so it was a real pleasure to get to speak to Mark.
This was a real pleasure. Thank you, Frank.
Frank, thank you very much for being on our podcast, Recreative.
Okay, we'll talk later.
Yes, absolutely.
Bye.
Bye. Joe, I'm really enjoying this. This has been fun, but I don't want to do this podcast anymore.
You're talking about stopping the podcast.
No, I'm just kidding. But I do want to take August off.
I just had a heart attack, Mark.
I was just trying to get that rise out of you. So yeah, I think we should take August off. I think we should end of July and come back after Labor Day.
I think that's a terrific idea. Why don't we do a special episode to finish the whole thing off?
A very special episode?
A very special episode, yes.
And we're going to launch your book, right?
Yes. We're going to launch my book, Adventures in the Radio Trade, with a special live edition of Recreative.
That sounds perfect. So we'll do that on the 30th.
Sunday the 30th will be a special live edition of Recreative, after which we'll take August off.
And then we'll be back on...
After Labor Day.
After Labor Day. I'll take my white pants off at that point.
Your white pants.
Right? Because you're not supposed to wear white after Labor Day.
Do I look like someone who pays any attention to that kind of...
Do I look like someone who has white pants?